I drove 900 miles to surprise my family. My father met me at the gate tuxedo. Sharp voice colder than the air. You don't belong here. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked away and took every dollar of his legacy with me. A month later, the only thing left of Bennett & Sons was the echo of his own words. I'm Claire Bennett, and this is how I learned that peace, not revenge, is the loudest answer. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning rain in Seattle was thin and steady, brushing against my apartment window like a quiet reminder that it was time to go. I had been awake since 4, moving through my small one-bedroom like a ghost. My suitcase was already zipped. The silver-wrapped wedding gift sat by the door next to a white envelope with the words, "For Emily," written in my handwriting. On the table, there was only one thing left I couldn't pack. The framed family photo taken 12 years ago before everything fell apart. I stood there for a moment, fingers grazing the glass. Mom's smile. Emily's braces. My father's hand resting on my shoulder, the one he later pretended never existed. I whispered, "It's just a wedding, not a war," and placed the photo face down. Outside, the sky was gray, that familiar Pacific Northwest kind of gray that made everything feel half awake. I loaded the trunk of my car suitcase, gift box receipts for the wedding services I had paid for. The flowers, catering deposit, even part of the venue cost. It wasn't much for me now, but for them it was everything. Or maybe I just wanted it to be. The drive out of the city was slow wipers, scraping rhythmically. Seattle faded behind me like a watercolor washed by rain. I told myself the same lie I'd been repeating for weeks. This time it'll be different. He's older now. Maybe he'll remember he has 2 daughters, not 1. Somewhere along I-84 in Oregon, I stopped for gas. The sky had cleared a little. I got out, stretching, rubbing the stiffness from my shoulders. The station attendant, a middle-aged man in a green jacket, nodded politely as he filled the tank. "Long trip?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Heading to Texas?" He grinned. "That's quite the drive. Business or pleasure?" I hesitated, then answered, "Family." After a beat, I added, "My sister's wedding." "Ah, big occasion then." "Yeah," I said softly. "Big." When he handed me the receipt, his eyes caught mine. There was kindness there, maybe curiosity. Like he could see the weight behind my small talk. I smiled out of politeness and drove off before the silence got too heavy. The rain picked up again as I climbed higher into the mountains. Trees blurred into dark lines against the mist. The hum of the tires filled the car, and with it came the memories I didn't invite. I was 26 again, standing in my father's office at Bennett & Sons Construction. The smell of coffee and sawdust mixed with his cologne. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes cold. "You embarrassed me, Claire," he said. "You went to the board behind my back. You made me look like a fool in front of my own employees. I told the truth, I'd said. You misused the client funds. They deserved to know." His face, hardened, voice low. "From now on, Bennett doesn't need someone like you." I remember the silence afterward, how it felt like a verdict. I walked out that day and didn't go back. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even when Mom called to say Emily graduated college. I told myself it was better that way. Now, as I drove past the endless stretch of highway, I wondered if he even remembered those words, or if he'd erased them the way he erased me. The thoughts stung more than I expected. By late afternoon, the light shifted. The sky ahead was a mix of orange and violet, that strange beauty right before dusk. I rolled the windows down for a while, letting the wind fill the car. The radio played some old country song about home, and I laughed bitterly. Home. I wasn't sure I had one anymore. I stopped at a rest area outside Boise to grab coffee. The young cashier asked, "Heading far, Texas?" I said again, and the word felt heavier this time. She smiled. "Hope it's a happy trip." I nodded, even though we both knew not every road trip ends with a happy reunion. Back on the road, I watched the miles tick by. 897 miles to go. I thought about Emily, how she'd been only 20 when I left. She used to send texts for a while. "Miss you, Dad's still mad, but Mom says hi. I got a new job." Then the messages stopped. I never asked why. Maybe I already knew. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as the sky dimmed. The last stretch of daylight clung stubbornly to the horizon. I could feel the ache in my chest growing with every mile. Fear, hope, resentment, all tangled together. I thought 8 years was enough time for him to forget. What I didn't realize was that for men like him, pride outlives memory. The highway grew darker. A truck passed, splashing water across my windshield. For a moment, I couldn't see. I pulled over to the shoulder, let the engine idle. My reflection stared back at me in the rearview mirror, eyes tired, jaw set. I whispered, "If he won't welcome me back, I'll make sure he never forgets I came." Then I started the car. Again, headlights slicing through the rain, the long stretch of road ahead swallowing me whole as I drove toward Austin, toward the one place I promised myself I'd never return. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, the heat had already soaked through my dress. Austin's sun had that heavy, unrelenting weight I'd almost forgotten, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes the air feel alive. The street outside my father's house shimmered a mirage of privilege and noise. From beyond the iron gate, I could hear the hum of string instruments, the clinking of glasses, and laughter. So much laughter. It should have sounded like home, but it didn't. The house itself looked nothing like the one I grew up in. The brick had been whitewashed, and the old oak tree was gone. In its place stood a floral archway dripping with white roses and fairy lights. My mother used to say she wanted a simple home, something warm and quiet, but this was a stage. I stepped out of the car, fixed my navy dress, smoothed my hair. My palms were damp against the silver-wrapped gift I carried. Just say hello. Hand her the gift and leave, I whispered to myself. My voice didn't sound convincing. A uniformed guard stood at the gate, holding a clipboard. "Guest list, ma'am." His polite tone felt like a wall. "Claire Bennett." I said, "Thomas is my father. The bride's my sister." He scanned the list, finger sliding down the page, then looked up, face neutral. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't here." For a second, the heat pressed harder against my skin. I smiled faintly. "Could you just call inside?" "Tell him I'm here." The guard hesitated, then turned to speak into his earpiece. Behind the gates, music drifted louder, violins swelling into some romantic tune I didn't recognize. People were arriving, shaking hands, laughing, holding champagne flutes. My heart thudded slower, heavier, like it was aware of what was coming. Then I saw him. Thomas Bennett, my father, in a black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, silver tie. Every inch the man who believed perfection was proof of worth. His hair was grayer, his frame a little heavier, but the posture hadn't changed. He walked toward the gate with the same confidence he used to walk into board meetings. "Claire," he said flatly, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see Emily," I said, forcing calm. "To give her this." I held out the gift box like it was a peace offering. He didn't look at it. "You weren't invited." "I know," I said quietly, "but I thought—" "You thought wrong." Behind him, a group of guests slowed curious. Some whispered. I saw recognition flicker in their eyes, like they'd heard my name in a story not meant for me to hear. "Dad." I tried again, lowering my voice. "I don't want to cause a scene. I just want to wish her well. That's it." His jaw tightened. "You've done enough damage. I won't let you ruin this too." "Ruin what?" "A wedding." I felt my breath tremble. "I paid for part of this, remember?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. His eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade. "Money doesn't buy you a seat in this family." For a heartbeat, everything stilled. The laughter from inside faded, replaced by the hum of cicadas and the faint music that somehow sounded cruel now. "Dad, please," I said, voice cracking. "It's been 8 years." He shook his head slowly. "You made your choice when you walked away. You don't belong here." He turned to the guard and gave a small nod. The man moved to close the gate. I felt my body tense as the metal doors groaned, swinging inward like a verdict. Through the narrowing gap, I caught a glimpse of Emily. She was standing at the edge of the courtyard, in her white dress veil, pinned perfectly, bouquet in hand. Our eyes met for the first time in almost a decade. For a moment, I thought she might move toward me. Her lips parted a step forward. Then she froze. My father looked back at her, subtle but sharp, and she turned away. The gate closed completely, the latch clicking into place. Behind the iron bars, I could still hear the ceremony begin. The music swelled. Someone laughed too loudly. A photographer called for the family to gather. I stood on the other side, holding the gift box like an anchor. A couple walking past glanced at me, polite but pitying. One of them whispered, "Isn't that his other daughter?" The words stung more than the sun. I set the box down by the gate next to a row of white lilies that lined the walkway. The silver paper shimmered under the light, absurdly beautiful in the dust and heat. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The world on the other side of that gate felt like a movie I was cut out of, and I couldn't stop watching. The guard cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, maybe you should go." "Yeah," I said, eyes still fixed on the house. "Maybe I should." I turned, walked back to my car. Every step felt heavier than the one before. When I reached the door, I caught a final reflection of the house in the car's window. The laughter, the lights, my father shaking hands with guests, like nothing had happened. I got in, started the engine, but didn't drive right away. My hands were trembling. I could still hear the muffled sound of the ceremony through the closed window, like ghosts applauding from far away. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. Sweat streaked my temples, mascara smudged just slightly. I almost laughed. 8 years, I murmured, and he still knows how to make it hurt. For a long moment, I just sat there. Then I shifted the car into gear, eyes still on the mirror, catching a flicker of Emily's white dress in the distance as she disappeared into the glow of the courtyard. The gate stood behind me, silent and unyielding, as I finally drove away into the fading Austin light. The sun had started to slip behind the rooftops, leaving a wash of orange across the sky that made the world look almost gentle. Almost. I parked across the street from the house in a narrow strip of asphalt meant for caterers and delivery vans. The sound of laughter floated across the road, carried by the dry Texas air, mixing with the cicadas. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I didn't move. I could see the glow of the courtyard lights in the reflection of my windshield, perfect little orbs of gold flickering against white roses and linen. I'd seen that same glow before years ago, when I was still welcome there. Through the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of my father, Thomas, walking Emily down the aisle. His posture straight, his smile rehearsed. From this distance, I couldn't see his face clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew that look. The look he saved for the cameras, the investors, the world he thought belonged only to men like him. He used to take me to his company's meetings when I was just out of college. "You'll see how a real leader earns respect." He told me once, hand on my shoulder, the smell of his cologne sharp in the air. This is what honor looks like. I'd believed him. I'd believed every word, until I realized that honor to him meant silence. I was 26 when I learned that truth. I'd spoken up about his misuse of client funds, and he'd called me a traitor. That was the day I learned that his version of honor didn't have space for me. The voice in my head was steady but cold as I whispered to myself. He taught me everything about pride, but nothing about love. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, breaking the quiet. Jordan's name lit up on the screen. For a second, I almost let it ring out, but I swiped to answer. "Hey," I said softly. "Claire, you made it. How's it going down there?" I stared out at the house. He told me I don't belong here. The line went silent for a moment. Then Jordan exhaled. "Jesus, Claire." I tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. "It's fine. He's consistent, if nothing else. Do you want me to book you a flight back tonight?" "No," I said quickly. "Not yet. Then at least get out of there. Don't sit and watch." I glanced at the front gate again. The wedding planner. A woman with blonde hair pulled tight into a bun was adjusting her headset, pacing near the entrance. She looked stressed. "I'll go soon," I murmured. "I just need a minute." Jordan sighed on the other end, then said gently, "You don't need to prove anything anymore." "I know," I said, but I didn't hang up right away. The truth was, I didn't know what I needed. Outside the planner. Anna. I remembered someone calling her, crossed the driveway camera in hand. When she noticed me sitting there, she hesitated. She approached slowly, keeping a professional smile. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," she said, leaning slightly toward my open window. "We're recording the event and, well, you might end up in the background of some of the shots." "It's your job," I said quietly. "Do what you have to do." "I really am sorry," she added, her voice softening. "It's a beautiful ceremony. Your sister looks lovely." I gave a faint nod. "I'm sure she does." Anna lingered another moment, then walked away, her camera light blinking red. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. The hum of the generators from the catering tents filled the air. Someone inside the courtyard shouted, "Let's get the father of the bride ready for the toast." I swallowed hard. It was nearly 7 now. The sky had turned the color of rust, and the courtyard lights burned brighter. Cars lined both sides of the street, each one polished and expensive. I could see waiters carrying trays of champagne through the open glass doors. I told myself to leave, to drive back to the motel, pack up, forget this place ever existed. But instead, I rolled the window down and listened. The faint echo of music reached me, followed by the murmur of guests. Every laugh felt like a nail tapping against my chest. Then, from across the street, I heard it. His voice, my father's. It carried sharp and unmistakable. "You don't belong here." It wasn't directed at me this time. He was probably repeating it, telling someone the story of what had just happened at the gate. But hearing it again, echoed through laughter, twisted something inside me. I looked up and saw a man standing near the entrance, with his phone raised recording. He adjusted his camera, trying to focus through the glass doors. I couldn't see who he was, just that he caught the sound clearly. For a split second, my father's voice cut through the air again, louder this time, like he wanted the world to hear it. "You don't belong here." The man with the phone flinched, his hand trembling slightly, but he kept recording. Guests turned to look. I imagined their faces, their polite smiles, their curiosity cloaked in pity. Something in me shifted. The heat in my chest turned to something cold sharp. I gripped the steering wheel, eyes burning. "You taught me how to stand tall," I whispered, "but you never thought I'd stand against you." I started the engine. The sound startled me. It felt too loud in the silence that followed his voice. The headlights flicked on, washing the pavement in pale light. My reflection in the rearview mirror was ghost-like eyes, rimmed red, but dry. For the first time that day, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. Somewhere out there, someone had captured the truth. Not my version, not his, just the truth. I didn't know who that man with the camera was, or what he planned to do with that footage. I didn't care. All I knew was that the next time my father looked into a camera and smiled, that voice of his, the one that had defined me for years, would finally echo back at him. I shifted into drive, pulled away from the curb. The mansion lights faded in my mirror, but the sound of his words lingered clear and defiant. "You don't belong here." For once, I didn't argue. I didn't belong there anymore. And that realization somehow felt like freedom. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old air conditioning. Outside, the Texas night was still alive. Crickets, the distant hum of a highway, the buzz of a broken neon sign flickering outside my window. I sat cross-legged on the narrow bed laptop, open in front of me, the soft glow reflecting off the tired yellow walls. The spreadsheet on my screen looked endless, each row, each number a quiet confession of years I couldn't get back. March 2021, $4, $500 transfer to Bennett & Sons Construction. June 2022, $7,000 labeled roof repairs. October 2023, $12,000 note, Emily's wedding. The cursor blinked like it was judging me. I took a slow breath and whispered, "You're not a daughter. You're a bank with a pretty smile." The words came out steadier than I expected. I clicked through my savings, my old statements, my emails. I could trace my entire family relationship in transactions. Birthday gifts, wired directly. Medical bills, paid, car repairs. Tuition, help, house, maintenance. Each one proof of my place. Useful, convenient, invisible. I opened my phone. The last text from my father glared back at me from a week ago. "You forgot the vendor payment. They're calling me about it. No greeting, no thank you, just business as usual." For years, I'd convinced myself that money was my way back in, that if I kept helping, kept giving, maybe one day he'd look at me and see more than the girl who embarrassed him. But sitting there with the numbers spread out like open wounds, I finally understood. You can't buy love that was never for sale. The cursor hovered over the recurring transfers tab. My chest tightened, but my hands didn't shake. I clicked cancel next to each line, one after another. $850 monthly to Thomas Bennett, $500 to Emily, corporate card access, terminated, sub-account privileges, revoked. Each click echoed like the closing of a door. When I reached the last one, I hesitated. My reflection stared back at me in the laptop screen. Eyes hollow, but clear. I hit confirm. The room went silent, except for the whir of the air conditioner. I leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. There was no satisfaction, no triumph. Just quiet. I composed a new email subject line, termination of financial support. To Thomas, Bennett and Bennett & Sons. Com, CC Accounting at Bennett Ansons. Com, E. Hayslaw@gmail.com. Body effective. Immediately, I am withdrawing all financial and administrative support related to Bennett & Sons Construction. All secondary cards, linked accounts, and monthly transfers have been canceled. Attached is documentation of my contributions over the past 8 years, totaling $163,400 verified by my bank. This correspondence serves as written notice. Regards, Claire Bennett. I reread it twice. No emotion, no unnecessary words. Just truth. Then I attached the files, clicked send, and watched the screen blink once before the message disappeared. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small. I felt final. The air conditioner rattled on, and a soft breeze came through the crack of the window, fluttering the thin motel curtain. My eyes landed on my open purse on the chair. Something had slipped out, a photo. It was creased at the edges, the colors slightly faded, me. Emily, Mom, and Dad standing on the front porch of the old house. I must have been 10. My father's arm rested across both our shoulders. His smile was wide and confident, the kind that made people trust him instantly. I used to love that about him. I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. "You're good at pretending, Dad," I whispered. I learned from the best. I placed the photo on the nightstand next to the room key and the half-empty cup of coffee. The bitterness clung to the air, mixing with the smell of dust and rain. Lying back on the bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the ache in my chest shift into something else. Something lighter. I thought about all those nights when I stayed up late, wiring money, convincing myself I was keeping the family together. Maybe I was never keeping it together. Maybe I was just delaying its collapse. When I finally drifted off, the laptop was still open, the screen glowing faintly beside me. Morning came sharp and bright. A strip of sunlight cut across the room, hitting the laptop and the phone on the nightstand. The silence was broken by a low buzz, then another, then another. I reached over, groggily grabbed the phone, and froze. 72 missed calls, 18 unread messages. Most were from Dad, a few from Mom, one from an unknown number. The first voicemail was his voice, tight and furious. "What the hell did you do, Claire? The company cards aren't working. Call me back immediately." Another followed seconds later. "You've made a mistake. Undo it. Do you hear me?" Then Mom's voice, softer, strained. "Claire, sweetheart, maybe we can talk about this. You know how your father is. Don't make it worse." I scrolled further. The final message came at 3:14 a.m. Text from Dad. "You'll regret this." I stared at those words until they blurred. Then I set the phone down gently, got out of bed, and walked to the mirror above the dresser. My hair was messy, my eyes still puffy from sleep. I didn't look powerful or victorious. But I looked awake. "Not this time," I said to my reflection. My voice was calm, steady. "You're the one who's going to regret it." Outside, the morning sun burned hotter than usual. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed its whistle long and low. I stood there, still barefoot on the cool tile floor, and let the sound fade before reaching for the doorknob. The world beyond that door felt bigger than it had in years. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't trying to be let in. I was walking away finally on my own terms. The knock on my door came before sunrise, 3 sharp raps that made me spill coffee on the counter. I opened it to find Jordan standing there in a hoodie, hair messy, holding her phone like a bomb she didn't want to drop. "You need to see this," she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. "It's 6 a.m, I muttered, wiping the counter with a towel. "Yeah, and your father's face is all over the internet." My stomach tightened. What Jordan swiped at her screen and turned it toward me. A video was playing. The same house, the same iron gate, the same voice I'd been trying to forget. Thomas Bennett stood in the doorway of his mansion, his words cutting through the hum of background noise. "You don't belong here." The clip lasted only 13 seconds, but that was all it took. The caption read, "Father of the bride denies his own daughter entry to the wedding gate." It had over 2 million views. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. The sound of his voice in that video was exactly how it had been that night, cold, rehearsed, unshakable. Jordan lowered the phone and said softly, "It's everywhere, Claire. TikTok, Reddit, local news, even LinkedIn. People are furious." I sat down on the couch, the room suddenly too bright. The morning light pushed through the blinds in sharp lines across the floor. The TV on the wall was still muted from last night. I grabbed the remote, turned it on. A morning news anchor's voice filled the room. In other headlines, local businessman Thomas Bennett is facing public outrage after a viral video surfaced from his daughter's wedding in Austin, Texas. In the video, Bennett appears to deny entry to his eldest daughter, Claire, who sources say traveled nearly 900 miles to attend. A photo of me from years ago appeared beside his, my work headshot from Evernorth Media. I looked polished, confident, someone who didn't belong in this story. The accord continued. The clip, posted under the hashtag WeddingGate, has sparked debate online about family loyalty, pride, and image. I turned the volume down almost to mute. Jordan whispered, "You okay?" I nodded, but my throat felt dry. "Karma doesn't wear armor," I said quietly. "It wears a wedding dress and carries a camera." She gave me a long look. "That's poetic. And maybe true." Later that afternoon, the story spread further. Every network replayed the same 13 seconds dissecting tone, context, expression. Commentators speculated about what led to the fight. They called me the estranged daughter. At noon, Thomas Bennett held a press conference outside his office building. I watched it live, coffee growing cold in my hand. "My family and I are victims of misinformation," he said, standing before the microphones flanked by 2 lawyers. "The video is edited, taken out of context. I love both my daughters. That moment has been misunderstood." But the reporters weren't buying it. One asked Mr. Bennett, "Did you or did you not deny your daughter entry to your younger daughter's wedding?" He gave that same tight smile, the one he used when he was cornered. "I'm not here to discuss private family matters," he said. Jordan scoffed at the TV. Classic PR move. Within hours, another video surfaced. A different angle. The audio was crystal clear this time. My father's voice was impossible to mistake. "You don't belong here." That clip alone gathered 3 million views in 6 hours. By evening, the news cycle had turned into a storm. Social media was a battlefield. Strangers defending me, others defending him. Some wrote essays about toxic parents. Others joked about karma. My phone vibrated nonstop. Notifications, messages from coworkers, distant cousins, even journalists. I ignored them all. Then came the email. From Thomas Bennett at Bennett Anson's. Subject. "This is your fault." I clicked it open. "You've destroyed my reputation. The company is in chaos. Partners are backing out. You think you've won? You'll see what happens when you ruin what I built. You'll regret this." I read it twice. Then I hit reply. I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped paying for it. I pressed send. That was it. No apology, no justification. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment lights of downtown Seattle, reflecting off the glass. Outside, a drizzle had started. Soft, steady, familiar. My city. My life. Miles away from the chaos I'd left behind. I scrolled through my phone one last time. The comments blurred together. "She's the real daughter. Imagine doing that to your own kid. Money can't hide who people are." I set the phone down, feeling something between relief and exhaustion. It was strange watching the world turn its gaze toward him. For so long, he'd controlled every narrative, every word. Now, all it took was a stranger's camera to undo decades of image building. The following morning, he was back on television. This time red-faced and shouting at reporters outside his office. I said it once, and I'll say it again. He barked into the microphones. "She is not my daughter anymore." The footage froze mid-frame, his mouth open mid-yell, his eyes wild. Every network ran that image. Every article used that headline. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned off the TV. The silence felt heavy, but deserved. In the reflection of the blank screen, I saw my own face, calm, still no longer breaking. For years, I'd feared his words would define me, but that night, I realized something simple and unshakable. He could erase me from his world, but he couldn't erase the truth. And now the whole world had heard it. The courthouse in downtown Austin smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Cameras flashed outside the steps, their clicks sharp and endless like insects in the heat. 2 months had passed since the video, and my father had decided that if he couldn't erase me, he'd try to bury me under paperwork instead. He filed a civil suit for defamation and financial damages. The words themselves felt absurd. Defamation? From a man who'd shouted his disownment to a crowd. I flew down from Seattle the night before, slept 3 hours in a hotel by the highway, and met Eleanor Hayes, my attorney, in the courthouse lobby that morning. She was calm as ever, her gray suit, pressed hair perfectly tied back, coffee in hand. She looked like she'd done this 1,000 times, which she probably had. As we walked toward the courtroom doors, she said quietly, "Whatever happens, don't take the bait. Your father wants a scene. He thrives on control. Just answer what's asked. Stick to the truth." I nodded, palms damp. "I don't want to fight him." "You already did," she said, "by showing up." Inside, the courtroom buzzed. Reporters filled the benches in the back, notebooks ready. A few spectators murmured, waiting for the show. My father sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his lawyer, a sleek man in a navy suit who looked like he'd never had dirt under his fingernails. My father didn't look at me when I walked in. His posture was perfect, chin. High hands folded on the table. When the bailiff called the room to order, the sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. "Case of Thomas Bennett versus Claire Bennett," the clerk read. Judge Karen Lopez presided, mid-50s, sharp eyes, reputation for no-nonsense rulings. She looked at my father, then at me. Mr. Bennett's lawyer began first. "Your Honor, my client's reputation has been irreparably harmed by the deliberate spread of false and misleading information. The viral video was manipulated and shared with intent to damage his public and professional standing." I glanced at Eleanor. She sat still, hands folded. When the lawyer gestured toward me, I kept my eyes forward. He continued, voice steady, confident. "Our investigation indicates that Mrs. Bennett benefited financially and socially from the circulation of the video, having aligned herself with anti-corporate media narratives that capitalize on family scandal." That line almost made me laugh. I had spent the last 2 months avoiding every interview request, ignoring sponsorship offers from talk shows that wanted to turn my pain into content. Judge Lopez turned to my father. "Mr. Bennett, do you have any direct evidence linking your daughter to the distribution of this video?" He leaned forward. "She's always had a flair for attention," he said. "You don't raise a child who defies you at 26 and expect her to stay quiet forever. She's been trying to ruin me since she left." The courtroom murmured. Judge Lopez's gaze sharpened. "That's not an answer." He hesitated. "No, I don't have proof she posted it. But who else would want to humiliate me? Half the internet." Apparently, I thought. But I didn't say it. When it was our turn, Eleanor stood, smoothing her jacket. "Your Honor, my client has never commented publicly about her father or this video. We've submitted logs from her social accounts and devices showing no evidence of posting or sharing the clip. The video originated from multiple guests, none of whom were connected to Ms. Bennett." She walked toward the screen set up beside the judge's bench. A still frame of the video appeared, my father at the gate, hand raised mid-sentence. "You don't belong here." The image froze there, harsh under courtroom lighting. "This," Eleanor said evenly, "is not defamation. It's documentation." The judge glanced at me. "Ms. Bennett, do you wish to make a statement?" I stood. My knees felt weak, but my voice didn't shake. "I didn't film that video. I didn't share it. I didn't need to. The truth speaks for itself." I was just standing there. Silence followed. Then my father slammed his hand on the table. "You stood there and let it happen." His voice cracked, something desperate bleeding through the anger. "You've always wanted to see me fall." I looked at him finally. "No," I said softly. "I just stopped holding you up." The judge's gavel struck once, cutting the air. Enough. The rest of the proceedings blurred together. Eleanor presented our evidence account logs, affidavits from guests confirming they recorded the event, timestamps proving the video spread organically. My father's lawyer objected twice, floundered once, and by the end the weight of their argument collapsed under its own arrogance. When the judge returned with her ruling, the room went still. The plaintiff has failed to provide evidence of defamation or intent to harm. The case is dismissed. The sound of the gavel this time wasn't sharp. It was final. My father's lawyer gathered his papers, quickly avoiding eye contact. My father sat motionless, staring ahead, as if he hadn't heard the words. His shoulders, once squared, now seemed to sag under the fluorescent lights. Eleanor leaned toward me. "You did well," she whispered. "Don't look back." Reporters surged forward as we stepped outside. Cameras flashed, questions flew. "Claire, any comment on the verdict? Will you sue for damages?" I said nothing. Eleanor blocked most of them with a polite but firm, "No statements today." The air outside was heavy and warm, the kind that stuck to your lungs. I walked down the courthouse steps slowly. Behind me, I heard the shutters of cameras clicking again, but I didn't turn around. At the bottom of the stairs, a breeze caught the edge of my hair. I stopped, tilted my face toward it, and breathed for what felt like the first time in months. Real honor doesn't need a stage. False honor can't survive without one. Eleanor joined me at the curb, handing me my sunglasses. "You just proved something important," she said. "What's that?" I asked. "That justice doesn't always make noise," she said. "Sometimes it's just the silence afterward." I smiled faintly, watching a leaf skitter across the pavement. The courthouse loomed behind us, but it already felt far away. "I didn't win against him," I said quietly. "I just stopped being afraid of him. And for the first time in years, I knew that was enough." The morning news played on the office TV while the rest of the team typed quietly, pretending not to listen. I didn't ask them to change the channel. There was no point. Every major network had the same headline running in bold across the screen. "After a failed defamation lawsuit, Bennett & Sons Construction has lost 3 major contracts," the reporter said. Lead partner David Ross announced his withdrawal from the company, citing irreparable loss of trust. Sources confirm the firm is also under review by the IRS for discrepancies in past filings. The footage cut to my father outside the courthouse. Head down, hands gripping a folder too tightly. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. His once polished suit looked like armor that no longer fit. Jordan glanced at me from her desk. "You won," she said softly. I didn't take my eyes off the screen. "No," I said. "He lost." She studied me for a moment. Same thing, but it didn't feel like winning. Watching him surrounded by cameras, shoulders slumped under the weight of his own undoing, I didn't feel satisfaction, just an ache hollow and strange. I thought victory would feel like relief. But when I saw him bow his head, I only felt the sound of something ending. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed in the office alone. The city lights of Seattle shimmered through the glass walls. The silence hummed louder than traffic below. I opened my laptop. Another headline popped up, Bennett legacy in question. My name appeared midway through the article. Former investor and daughter Claire Bennett. They called me the whistleblower who'd unintentionally sparked a reckoning. I shut the lid and leaned back in my chair. The air felt heavy. For years I'd believed the world was too small for both of us. Now that his empire was crumbling, the silence between us felt endless. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it. The name on the screen made me stop. Emily. Her message was short. "Can we talk, please?" I stared at it for a long time before typing back. "Where?" She sent the address of a small cafe on the outskirts of Austin. "I'll be there." I wrote, surprising myself. The next evening, I sat in that cafe, an old roadside diner with chipped paint and the smell of burnt coffee. The ceiling fan creaked. The waitress poured water into my glass and smiled, recognizing me from the news. I didn't smile back. Emily arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a plain white dress, her hair pulled into a bun. She looked younger than I remembered, but also older, in ways that had nothing to do with time. When she saw me, she froze at the door, then walked over slowly. "Hi," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "Hi," I said. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then she sat down, hands trembling around her napkin. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. I almost didn't. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Finally, she whispered, "He made me cut you off." "Claire," her eyes glistened. "He said if I talked to you again, he'd cancel the wedding. Said I had to choose between you and my future." I didn't speak. "I chose wrong," she said. "I thought I was being smart, staying on his good side. I thought maybe I could fix things later when he calmed down." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But he never calms down, does he?" I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "You don't have to apologize for surviving," I said quietly. "We all did what we had to do, to stay close to him." She let out a shaky laugh. "You sound like Mom." I smiled faintly. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Emily took a deep breath, then reached into her purse. She pulled out a small silver flash drive and slid it across the table. "I found this while cleaning out my computer," she said. "It's a recording Dad made right after the wedding. He thought I deleted it, but I couldn't. I needed to keep it, to remind myself who he really is. I stared at the flash drive but didn't touch it. What's on it? She swallowed. He was talking to one of his investors. They were worried about the video about the backlash. He told them, "She's not my daughter. She never was. She's just a mistake that knows how to talk." My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed even. "You kept it all this time?" She nodded. "Because I couldn't forget the way he said it. Like it wasn't even cruel. Just factual." I finally picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my hand. It was lighter than I expected. "Emily," I said softly. "I'm not going to use this." She blinked. "You should. It would destroy him." I shook my head. "He's already destroyed himself. The world doesn't need my help to see who he is, and I don't need to become like him to prove I'm not." She wiped her eyes, then smiled weakly. "You always were the brave one." "No," I said, "just the first to stop pretending." We sat there until the waitress came by with the check we hadn't ordered. The coffee had gone cold between us. Outside, the neon sign flickered the same tired rhythm as the one outside that motel months ago. When we stood, Emily hugged me tight. I felt her shoulders shake, her breath catching against my neck. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. "I know," I said. "Just don't let him break you the way he broke me." As I walked out to my rental car, I looked down at the flash drive in my palm, glinting faintly under the streetlight. I slipped it into my pocket. I didn't need revenge. What I needed was peace. And peace, I was learning, starts when you stop keeping score. When I reached the highway, I rolled the windows down. The warm night air rushed in, filling the car with the scent of summer. The city lights faded in the distance, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from him anymore. I was simply driving away. It was raining again in Seattle when Jordan burst into my office, soaked to the shoulders, phone in hand. "You're not going to believe this," she said, shaking off her umbrella onto the carpet. "Susan Delgado just called me. She wants you on her show." I looked up from my computer, half listening. The reporter from Channel 9. Jordan nodded, catching her breath. "Yeah. She's producing a segment called When Blood Turns Cold. It's about family betrayal, corporate power, all of that. They want you to tell your side." I leaned back in my chair. "No. Claire. No," I said again, sharper this time. "I'm not doing another public circus. I don't want to talk about him anymore." Jordan sighed, pacing the room. "This isn't about him. It's about you. You could finally take control of the story, instead of watching everyone else twist it." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was Eleanor Hayes. I picked up. "Susan Delgado wants an interview," she said, her tone calm as always. "You too," I muttered. "She called me first," Eleanor said. "I told her I'd ask you. Look, I know you hate the spotlight, but sometimes silence is mistaken for guilt. If you want to reclaim your voice, do it once, on your terms. Be calm, be factual, then walk away." I stared at the gray skyline outside my window. What if it starts everything again? Eleanor paused. "Then finish it properly this time." 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a studio under lights soft enough to feel like forgiveness. The backdrop was navy blue, the air faintly cool. I wore a simple blazer and no jewelry. Eleanor's advice: no distractions, just truth. Susan Delgado greeted me with a firm handshake and a kind smile that didn't quite hide her curiosity. "Thank you for doing this, Claire," she said. "I know it's not easy. I'm here because I'm tired of other people telling my story." I said. When the cameras rolled, the red light blinked on. My pulse matched its rhythm. Susan started with the obvious. "You never released the video that caused your father's downfall. Can you confirm that?" I nodded. "Yes. I didn't record it. I didn't post it. I didn't need to. I just stood there. Other people saw what I saw and shared it, so you had no part in spreading it, no. All I did was stop funding a lie. The moment I stopped paying for their version of reality, the truth had room to breathe." Susan leaned forward slightly. "Do you regret any of it?" I took a slow breath. The question hung in the air, heavy but familiar. "I used to regret a lot of things," I said, like loving the wrong people, believing that loyalty could change someone who didn't want to change. But standing up for myself, I looked straight into the camera. "No, I don't regret that." The studio fell silent for a beat, only the hum of lights above. Susan nodded, her expression softening. "Some say this is poetic justice. Others call it family tragedy. What do you call it?" I thought for a moment. "Accountability." I said, finally, "That's all I ever wanted. Not revenge, not fame, just accountability. The taping lasted 40 minutes, though it felt shorter. When the cameras stopped, Susan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That was powerful," she said quietly. "People will see you for who you are now." I smiled faintly. Let's hope they see him too. The episode aired 3 nights later. I didn't watch it live, but my phone lit up within minutes. Texts from coworkers, messages from strangers, emails from women I'd never met. "You said what I never could. Thank you for reminding me that walking away isn't weakness." Jordan called halfway through. "It's trending, Claire. You're trending." I sat on my couch, blinds half drawn. The TV muted in the background. That's not what I wanted. "I know," she said, "but maybe it's what people needed." Across the country in Austin, Thomas watched too, or so the news later said. A cameraman caught him through the glass wall of his office, his face tense as my voice played from the TV behind him. When Susan asked me, "Do you still love your father?" I'd answered, "I love who I thought he was." According to the reporter's notes, he stood up, turned off the television, and walked out without a word. The office he left behind was empty by the next morning. By dawn, headlines appeared online. Bennett & Sons shuts down. Operation amid fallout. Thomas Bennett sells family estate. When Jordan showed up at my apartment with the newspaper, I was still in my robe, half awake, coffee steaming in my hands. She dropped the paper on the counter. The headline read, "Bennett Legacy Collapses. Daughter's Interview Sparks." Final exodus. I stared at the photo. My father leaving his office building for the last time, suit-wrinkled expression unreadable. For years he had been the symbol of control. Now he looked like a man undone by his own reflection. Jordan exhaled slowly. "It's over, Claire." I nodded. "Maybe." She tilted her head. "You don't feel anything." I looked back at the paper at his slumped shoulders, the empty hands that once held everything. "I thought I would." I said, "I thought I'd feel triumphant. But when I saw him bow his head, I just felt empty." Jordan didn't respond. She just set her mug down beside mine and sat with me in silence. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle, tapping lightly against the window. The morning light caught the edge of the newspaper, and, for a moment, everything felt still. Karma moves slow, but it never loses its way. I folded the paper and placed it in the drawer, closing it softly. The chapter was ending not with applause, not with vengeance, but with quiet. Just quiet. The first hint of autumn had arrived in Seattle. The air carried that faint bite that made you reach for a sweater even when the sun was out. When I stepped outside my apartment that morning, the street smelled of rain and roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs. My mailbox was stuffed with the usual bills, flyers, a catalog I'd never subscribed to, but one envelope stood out. It was cream-colored, addressed in a familiar handwriting, Emily. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just holding it. The return address was Austin. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. The faint scent of her perfume drifted out, floral and sweet, the same she used when we were teenagers. Inside were 2 things, a handwritten letter and a small photograph. I unfolded the paper carefully. Her voice echoed in my head as I read, "Dear Claire, I don't know how to start this. Maybe there's no right way. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner. I thought silence would make things easier, but it only made the wrong people comfortable. I wanted to tell you that I left him. I'm on my own now. The house is gone. The company's gone. Dad hasn't called me in months. The last thing he said to me was, 'Don't make the Bennetts look worse than they already do.' I guess he forgot you and I are still Bennetts too." I could almost hear the small laugh she might have given after that line. Half bitter, half sad. "I saw your interview. You were brave. I'm proud of you. I know that might not mean much now, but I mean it. You're the only one in this family who never made me feel ashamed to be myself. Maybe one day you'll forgive me for all the times I didn't stand up for you, but even if you don't, I want you to know I understand you now, and I'm sorry." I stopped reading for a moment. The street outside was quiet, except for a passing bus and the faint cry of a seagull. My eyes blurred as I traced her handwriting. She'd always written in soft loops, every letter connected, like she couldn't bear to lift the pen. The letter continued. "I enclosed one of the wedding photos, not because I want you to remember that day, but because I finally see the truth in it. Look at Dad's face. Look at mine. You can see it, can't you?" The smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The line in the corner of his mouth that says everything he'll never admit. It's the picture of a family pretending. I'm done pretending. Love, Emily. At the bottom of the envelope, a smaller note had fallen out. A scrap torn from a notepad written in her quick, slanted scrawl. Honor doesn't save anyone. I set the letter down, staring at the words until they blurred. For years I'd told myself that Emily would never see him for who he was. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she'd just needed time to survive him in her own way. I tucked the letter back into the envelope and walked into my living room. The morning light poured across the floor, glinting off the small wooden box that sat on the corner shelf. The one that held everything I hadn't been able to throw away. Inside were small keepsakes, Mom's wedding ring, a childhood photo, a faded business card from Bennett & Sons. I placed the envelope on top. Then I hesitated. Something about the way the light hit the papers made me notice another folder buried beneath them, one I hadn't opened in years. It was a manila envelope labeled in my old handwriting, transfer agreement, Bennett & Sons Construction 2010. I pulled it out, heart thudding. Inside were the documents from when I'd signed over my shares to my father. At least that's what I'd thought I'd done. The papers were stamped and initialed, but as I scanned the final page, something caught my eye. The notary line, blank, no official seal, no witness signature. I flipped through again, faster this time. My name appeared on every page, but his signature was missing on the final one. He never filed it. My breath caught. On paper, legally, I still owned 37% of Bennett & Sons Construction, the largest share. The company that no longer existed was technically still partially mine. For a moment, I just sat there stunned. All those years he'd told me I was nothing to the family, nothing to the company, and yet, even in erasing me, he'd failed to finish the job. He thought I belonged to his past. But all along, the past belonged to me. I stood and walked to my desk, pulling out my phone. It was early, but Eleanor always answered my calls. She picked up on the second ring. "Claire," she said, her voice warm, but alert. "You okay?" I found something, I said, trying to steady my breathing. The transfer documents for the company. He never finalized them. My shares are still active. There was a pause. "Are you serious?" I checked twice. "It's all here. His signature's missing." Eleanor exhaled the kind of sigh that came from years of seeing irony play out in legal form. "You realize what that means, right? Technically, you're still a majority shareholder. If you wanted to, you could claim ownership of whatever's left of Bennett & Sons." "I don't want it," I said quickly. "I just want to end it officially this time." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with the shares?" I looked back at the wooden box on the table, the photo of my mother smiling faintly from within. "Transfer them," I said. "Set up a fund in her name. Something good. Something clean." Eleanor's tone softened. "You sure you could sell them? It's not a small amount, I'm sure. I've paid enough for that name already. I'll draft the paperwork," she said. "We'll call it the Margaret Fund." I smiled, the first real smile in days. Perfect. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring out at the gray Seattle sky. A light breeze brushed the curtains, and the sound of leaves rustling outside filled the quiet. It felt like closing a book, not slamming it shut in anger, but setting it down gently, knowing I didn't need to read another page. I reached for the envelope one more time, touched the edge of Emily's handwriting, and whispered, "You were right, Em. Honor doesn't save anyone, but maybe peace does." And for the first time in years, peace didn't feel like something far away. It felt like something I'd finally chosen. Rain fell in thin, steady lines against the window of Laura Kim's cafe, tracing the glass like veins of silver. The smell of espresso and cinnamon lingered in the air. It was the kind of quiet morning Seattle did best. Gray, slow, unhurried. Laura slid a cup of coffee toward me and took the seat across the small wooden table. "You've been here more often lately," she said, smiling. "I might start charging you rent." "I'm funding your business," I teased, stirring a packet of sugar into the cup. "You're funding my sanity," she said, taking a sip of her tea. "How's the foundation coming along?" I smiled faintly. The Margaret Fund is official now. The papers went through last week. We're starting small, grants for single mothers finishing their degrees, community classes, that kind of thing. Eleanor helped set up the legal side. "That's good." Laura said, eyes warm. "Something clean born out of something messy. That's rare." I looked down at my coffee. It feels right, like it belongs to the right people this time. She tilted her head. "You're not going back to Austin, are you?" I didn't need to think about it. No, there's nothing left for me there. Laura studied me for a moment. You know, she said softly, forgiveness isn't weakness. I smiled, but it was tired. I don't hate him, Laura. I just don't need him anymore. She leaned back, her expression thoughtful. I used to tell myself that too, she said quietly. After my divorce. I said I didn't need to forgive Mark because I didn't care, but every time someone mentioned his name, I still felt that pull. Anger, resentment, something. It took years before I realized that not forgiving him kept him living in my head rent-free. I met her eyes. You think I'm still carrying him around? She shrugged. Maybe not him. Maybe just the shadow he left behind. The rain grew heavier, a gentle percussion against the glass. Outside, people hurried under umbrellas, their reflections streaking across the wet pavement. I let out a slow breath. He took so much space for so long. I don't know if forgiveness would give me peace or just reopen the wound. Laura smiled faintly. Maybe it's neither. Maybe it's just cleaning the room so you can breathe again. I looked out the window, following the path of a raindrop, as it slid down, merged with another, and disappeared. You make it sound simple. It's not, she said, but it's worth trying. For a long while we just sat there listening to the rain and the soft jazz playing from the corner speaker. The cafe was half empty, the kind of space where even silence felt comfortable. Maybe forgiveness isn't about opening the door for someone to come back. Maybe it's just dusting off the old corners so you can finally breathe again. Laura broke the quiet. You know what's funny? Every time you come here, it rains. I smiled. Maybe that's the universe's way of reminding me I live in Seattle. She laughed. Maybe. Or maybe it's washing something clean for you. When I left the cafe, the rain had softened into a drizzle. The air smelled like wet concrete and roasted beans. I pulled my coat tighter and walked the few blocks back to my apartment, feeling oddly light. Inside the apartment was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I dropped my keys on the counter, slipped off my shoes, and sat at my desk. The papers from the foundation were still neatly stacked beside my laptop. I opened the computer and stared at the blank email screen for a long moment. Then I began typing. To hazelaw@gmail.com. Subject: close the Bennett file body. Eleanor. Please finalize the closure documents for Bennett & Sons. I want everything formally ended. No open claims, no pending accounts. I'm done. I'm not related to it anymore. Not legally, not emotionally. Thank you for helping me see this through. Claire. I read it twice, then pressed send. The whoosh of the outgoing email filled the room, a sound softer than rain, but somehow heavier. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city through the window. The reflection of the monitor's light glowed against the glass, tracing over my face like a second version of myself. Calmer, quieter, unburdened. For years my nights had been filled with what-ifs. What if he called? What if I'd stayed? What if he'd said, sorry? But tonight none of those questions mattered. The story had already ended. I got up, walked to the window, and pressed my palm lightly against the cool glass. Outside, the world looked soft around the edges. The kind of softness that comes only after a storm. Behind me, the inbox pinged. Eleanor's reply already in. Consider it closed. I smiled faintly, turned off the lights, and let the rain keep falling. The call came early on a cold morning in February. I was still half asleep when the phone buzzed on my nightstand, Eleanor's name glowing across the screen. Claire, her voice was soft but deliberate. He wants to see you. It took me a moment to understand who she meant. Thomas, yes. He reached out through his accountant. He's in Austin. He said it's not about money, not a lawsuit, just a conversation. I sat up, the blanket sliding from my shoulders. After all this time, I wouldn't have called if I didn't think it mattered, Eleanor said. You don't owe him anything, but maybe it's worth hearing what he has to say. Outside, the rain hit the windows with a steady rhythm. I stared at the faint light creeping through the blinds. Does he know I might say no? Eleanor hesitated. He said he'd be at the old lakeside park near his house tomorrow morning. If you come, you come. If you don't, he'll understand, but he wouldn't. Thomas Bennett never understood silence. Still, after I hung up, I found myself booking a flight. The next morning, Austin greeted me with the same dry chill it always had in winter. The air smelled of cedar and lake water. When I reached the park, the grass was brittle pale from the season. The benches looked smaller than I remembered the trees older. He was already there. Thomas sat on a wooden bench by the water coat buttoned to his neck, a gray scarf tucked neatly underneath. His hair, once jet black, had turned nearly white. The wind pushed against him, but he didn't seem to notice. When I approached, his shoulders stiffened slightly, as if bracing for something heavy. He turned his head, eyes finding me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Claire," he said finally, his voice rougher, slower. "Thank you for coming." I stayed, standing a few steps away. "I wasn't sure I would." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I don't blame you." The silence stretched between us, broken only by the soft lap of the lake against the shore. I could smell the faint trace of pine and cold metal. He looked smaller than the man who used to fill every room with his presence. "I can't undo the past," he said after a long pause. "I can't fix what I broke. But I wanted you to know I see it now, all of it." I crossed my arms more out of instinct than defense. "See what exactly?" His eyes met mine, glassy but steady. "That I cared more about being right than being kind. That I mistook control for love. That I built a house so big there was no room left for the people living in it." I studied him carefully. The voice that used to cut through boardrooms now trembled with the weight of something close to humility. "I don't need your apology," I said quietly. "I just needed to know you were capable of seeing the truth." He looked out over the water. "I used to think you didn't belong in my world," he said. "Now I realize I was the one who didn't belong in yours." A gust of wind swept across the lake, carrying a scatter of leaves past our feet. I watched him reach up to smooth his scarf, the simple gesture oddly human, fragile. I sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a space between us. For a while we didn't talk. We just sat listening to the distant sound of ducks on the water and the faint murmur of traffic from the road beyond the trees. Not every meeting is meant to heal. Some exist only to mark the quiet end of a story. He broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about coming back?" "Back to what I asked?" He gave a small, sad laugh. "Fair enough. I built a life in Seattle," I said. "It's simple, honest. I like who I am there." He nodded, still staring ahead. "You always knew who you were. I just didn't want to see it. It made me feel small." The confession hung in the air, sharp and soft all at once. He turned to me again. "Your mother used to say you had my stubbornness. She was right, but you use it better." I didn't know what to say to that. I looked out at the rippling water instead. "I got the letter from Emily," I said. "She left him." He closed his eyes for a second. "I heard she sent me the same one. Did you read it?" "I did," he said quietly. And for the first time I didn't try to argue with it. We sat there until the sun began to break through the clouds, turning the lake silver. I could hear my heart slowing, matching the rhythm of the waves. I stood, brushing the frost from my coat. "I should go." He didn't look up. "Claire," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just hope one day you'll remember that I tried." I watched him for a long moment. His hands rested on the bench fingers, still pale. "I don't need to forgive you," I said. "But I can wish you peace." He nodded slowly, eyes glinting with something that might have been tears. I took a few steps away before I heard him speak again, his voice carried softly by the wind. "Now I believe you do belong to your own world." I turned back once. He was looking out over the lake again, his reflection wavering on the surface. As I walked toward the parking lot, the sound of the water faded behind me. The air was cool, clean. I didn't feel angry or sad or vindicated. I just felt done. By the time I reached my car, the first warm light of afternoon had broken through the clouds. The city was waking up, unaware of the quiet ending that had just unfolded by the lake. And maybe that was exactly how it was supposed to be. A year passed quietly, almost without me noticing. Seattle bloomed early that spring. The air smelled of salt and coffee, the sky a soft watercolor of gray and gold. I walked through the glass doors of the new office, greeted by the hum of laughter, the clack of keyboards, and the smell of fresh paint. The sign on the wall read, "Harbor Women Initiative. Ours." Laura was already there, her glasses perched low as she reviewed a grant proposal. "Morning, boss," she said with a grin. "Don't call me that," I said, setting my bag down. "We're partners." She smiled, not looking up. "Still, you're the reason we're here." The office was bright and open, all soft light and warm wood. Around us, a handful of women worked on laptops, their energy filling the space with something I hadn't felt in years: hope. They weren't employees. They were dreamers building something real, something of their own. I passed by a table where two young designers were sketching branding concepts for a client's small bakery. One of them looked up and said, "Claire the Smith grant got approved." "That's amazing," I said, smiling genuinely. "You did the work. Celebrate it." In my office, sunlight pooled on the floor near the window. On my desk sat two framed photos, one of my mother smiling softly in her nurse's uniform, and the other of Emily holding her newborn daughter. I touched the edge of the frame. Emily's letter still sat folded in the top drawer. We talked now, not often, but enough. Enough to know we had both survived him in our own ways. A knock came on the door. Jordan leaned in holding a magazine. Guess who made the cover of Business Northwest? I raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. Another article about Bennett & Sons liquidation. She laughed. Nope. Better. She flipped the magazine toward me. My own face stared back, smiling in a headshot I barely remembered taking. The headline read, "Top 100 Women of Influence. Claire Bennett, founder of Harbor Women Initiative." I shook my head. Oh, for God's sake. Jordan sat down across from me, grinning. You've come a long way from that apartment with the broken heater. I looked at the photo again, then set the magazine aside. You know, I used to want people to notice me, to recognize my name. Now I just want the people who work here to feel like they can stand on their own. That's enough. Jordan tilted her head. That's the thing, though. They're noticing you because you stopped needing it. I smiled, not disagreeing. When she left, I walked out onto the balcony. The city stretched below, cranes, ferries, the faint shimmer of Elliott Bay. The air carried that mix of salt and pine unique to this place. From here I could see everything. The skyline I once thought I'd never reach, the water that never stopped moving. I leaned on the railing, coffee in hand. I once wanted them to see me. Now I just want them to live honestly, the way I finally learned to. The breeze tugged at my hair, cool and steady. Across the water, the sun broke through a low bank of clouds, scattering light across the bay. I closed my eyes and let it warm my face. A flash of memory slipped through, my father standing at the iron gate saying, "You don't belong here." Then another. Years later, the same man, older and tired, sitting by the lake, whispering, "Maybe I'm the one who doesn't belong." I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't love him either. Not in the way a daughter once did. What I felt now was something quieter, deeper acceptance. He had been a storm. I had learned to live beyond it. If time is the enemy, then peace is the only victory worth keeping. Behind me, I heard laughter. Laura arguing playfully with Jordan about who was the better baker. Someone put on music, something slow and bright. The office felt alive. I walked back inside, poured myself another cup of coffee, and stood by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the floor. The world outside kept moving. Ships leaving the harbor gulls, wheeling above the pier people, crossing streets, carrying their own quiet battles and victories. I took a sip and smiled to myself. Family isn't about blood. I murmured the words more truth than I'd ever spoken before. It's about respect, and for the first time I knew exactly what peace felt like. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady like the tide. If someone were to ask me what happened after I'd tell them this, sometimes the best revenge is not proving anyone wrong. It's living so fully that their words no longer matter. So if anyone ever tells you that you don't belong somewhere, remember, your place is waiting behind you, just beyond the fear, just beyond the noise. You only have to be brave enough to walk toward it. And maybe when you do, you'll find what I did, that peace in the end is the most beautiful kind of revenge there is.